Today we are going to discuss one of the questions from the Political Science and International Relations question paper of 2024. Is the USA using NATO to perpetuate its hegemony? Let us get into the background of this question and what we are expected to know. So basically, the NATO stands for the North Atlantic. This was a military alliance which was established by the USA. This was a military alliance. The most special thing about NATO, established by the USA during this was a military alliance which was established by the USA during the Cold War. The most special thing about NATO is that the NATO says an attack on one is an attack on all. So an attack by an enemy on one of the countries which are present in NATO will be taken by the other members of NATO to be an attack on all of them. And all of them will get together and they will retaliate back on that enemy. So, this is the basic principle of a military pact. This is a basic principle of NATO, which is explicitly mentioned in the NATO Charter. The Charter is basically the document which, when you formally accede to, when a country formally agrees to, then the country agrees to that. So, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the NATO, it has its origin in the Cold War period. And it was an instrument, it was a mechanism through which the United States sought to establish military alliances. In the Cold War period, the main membership of the NATO came from Western Europe. So countries like France, countries like Germany, they were the main member states of NATO. Now what happens is in 1991, the Cold War ends. Okay? And during the Cold War, there were two parties. There was the United States and there was the USSR. So the Cold War ends with the defeat of USSR and the victory of the United States. So the USSR also had its own military alliance. It used to have its own military alliance. This military alliance was called the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact is named after a city in Poland which is called Warsaw. And the Warsaw Pact was a military pact for the USSR to bind together its own allies. Most of the members of the USSR were countries in Central Europe and countries in Eastern Europe. NATO, the new member countries that were added by NATO, these member countries were mostly the countries of Central Europe and Eastern Europe, which used to be allies of USSR. Now, we can understand that the expansion of NATO to allies new members in Central and Eastern Europe, like I mentioned, would be a source of suspicion, would be a source of discomfort for Russia, because these countries, they were allies of the USSR. But today, most of the new member countries of NATO are countries which were former allies of the USSR. Scholars today, they talk about something called NATO expansionism. This is a key word, NATO expansionism. And this basically refers to the process whereby the USA and other NATO member countries are expanding the membership of NATO to new member states. Most of these member states are located in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. Most of these new member states are countries which used to be allies of the USSR under the Warsaw Pact. So these are countries with a long military history of being allied with the USSR. And these are the countries which are now being offered NATO membership. Furthermore, there are countries which share borders, land borders with Russia. And these countries are being offered NATO membership, and several of them have become NATO members as well. So we can understand, given the history of the Cold War, that the newly acquired members, which are erstwhile former allies of the USSR, now being allies of the USA, that is going to cause a lot of discomfort for Russia. Russia is going to feel threatened. Now, one of the things under the NATO is that several times the territory, the physical territory of a particular country, is going to be used to station weapons, and that includes nuclear weapons. So, if you are a NATO country, and even if you border Russia, even if you have a direct border with Russia, if you are a NATO country, the NATO can station nuclear arsenal on your territory. Okay, the NATO has several nuclear capable countries. The NATO includes USA, the NATO includes UK, and the NATO includes France. These are three recognized nuclear powers. Okay, so the NATO can station its nuclear arsenal on any of these territories. Now, this is a major source of threat to Russia. So, the problem with NATO expansionism is that this expansionism is primarily to former allies of the USSR, to countries which are direct neighbors of modern Russia, and that NATO membership also means that all kinds of extremely dangerous weapons can now be stationed on their territories, and this includes nuclear weapons. Okay, so now let's come back to our question. How would we address this question? What would be the template of our answer? So, USSR uses NATO to perpetuate its hegemony. First, we must explain to the examiner that we understand what NATO is. So, you have to mention that NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that it's a military alliance which was established during the Cold War by the United States. Okay, now the second part of this is you have to mention that. So, what is the importance of NATO? Okay, you establish a military alliance. What do you seek to do through this military alliance? So, then you must talk about the fact that NATO was part of a strategy to contain its rivals by the United States. Okay, so the NATO was part of a strategy to contain its rivals by the United States. So, herein you are demonstrating to the examiner that you understand what is the principle of a military alliance, you understand what is the objective. During the Cold War, the USA used all kinds of means. There were many kinds of approaches that were taken in order to uh, debilitate and weaken the USSR. Okay, the NATO was one of them. It was one of those mechanisms. So it was part of the strategy to contain its rivals. Then you have to talk about the USSR also had a similar alliance called the Warsaw Pact. So then you must mention about the Warsaw Pact, and that the membership of the Warsaw Pact consisted primarily of countries in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, which had long standing military and historical relations with USSR. Okay, then you must mention about the fact that after the end of the Cold War, the USSR dissolved and the Warsaw Pact was also dissolved. So, while the military alliance established by the USSR, that is, the Warsaw Pact, was dissolved, the NATO still continues to exist. Then you must mention the keyword NATO expansionism. Modern day scholars and NATO expansionism, that primarily the membership is now extending to countries which were former allies of the USSR. It's extending to countries which share, so 3 points here: former allies of the USSR, geographical borders with Russia. Third is stationing of nuclear weapons and the threat emanating from that. Then you have to display that you analyze all of these developments. So you must give your own opinion on the subject matter, and you must say that all these activities of NATO expansionism, they show us that the United States is using them as tools to isolate countries whom it perceives to be its rivals, such as Russia. So, and in doing so, it is striving to protect its hegemony or to protect its preeminent place in the world. That it is using NATO as a mechanism in order to contain its rivals, in order to weaken its rivals, in order to debilitate its rivals. It is poaching off. It is poaching off the traditional allies of its rivals, such as Russia, and also that uh, it is trying to isolate it is trying to isolate countries which it perceives as its rivals, such as Russia. So, this would be your answer. Now, it is also appropriate to add just a little bit about the Quad, because the Quad has been called Asian NATO. Okay, why am I even suggesting that you should include Quad a little bit in the answer is because Quad has been called Asian NATO. So, to tell the examiner that you actually understand that uh, this is about protecting the USA's hegemony, and that therefore you have to mention just one line or two line about the Quad, and therefore you can say that the Quad, which some have labeled Asian NATO, is also viewed as part of the strategy to contain its rivals in the Indo Pacific, primarily China. So, you also have to, in a sense, you have to convey to the examiner that yes, I understand the question is about NATO, I understand it's about protecting US hegemony, but the Quad has been called Asian NATO. And so, you have to display, and what is happening now is Russia used to be the rival of the USA. Today, the rival is China. So the question is not complete unless we have addressed that shift, unless we have addressed that geopolitics has moved forward. So that is why you have to include a line saying that the Quad, which many have labeled Asian NATO, is also a strategy to contain Chinese presence, to weaken Chinese influence in the Indo Pacific. And that is when you would have a complete answer. And at the very end, you should also say that the USA emerged as the only superpower after the end of the Cold War, and therefore it is utilizing many strategies in order to protect this position from emerging rivals. So, in a sense, let us say you have a king, okay, somebody is king. The king has many rivals. There are many people who would like to overthrow the king and take his crown, take his place. The USA is in a similar situation. Okay, so the USA is trying to fend off its rivals. And in order to fend off its rivals, it has to use many kinds of strategies. And the NATO is one of those strategies. It is a military strategy, but we must mention a little bit about the Quad because, as I told you, now in the contemporary period, in today's period, the main rival of the USA is no longer Russia. Most of the US security analysts, most of the US military analysts, most of the officials in the Pentagon refers to the military establishment, the military elite of the USA. Most of these people today view China as the major threat. So we have to communicate, we have to be smart about it. Now, we can't make the question, we have to answer the question whatever they have asked, but we have to mention one line that we understand that the rivalry is moving from Russia, it's moving towards China. And so you have to mention that the Quad, which is perceived to be Asian NATO, is a mechanism to reduce Chinese influence in the Indo Pacific. and at the end say that, like all superpowers, the United States is also striving to protect its supremacy, to protect its hegemony. And that is when your answer would be complete.